Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to today's program titled DDPA Teach-In, Demystifying the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. This conversation is a side event to the second session of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, and is sponsored by the National Conference of Black Lawyers and the National Lawyers Guild International Committee. My name is Kerry McLean. I'm an international human rights lawyer, an activist, a co-chair of the National Lawyers Guild International Committee, and former co-chair of the NCBL's International Affairs section. At the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, which by the way was a third World Conference Against Racism, a historic document was adopted by consensus. The Durban Declaration and Program of Action, or DDPA, is a comprehensive document that proposes concrete measures to combat racial discrimination. It addresses a wide range of issues and contains recommendations that have the potential to have far-reaching impact. The conference agreed, amongst other things, that slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity, which was historic. The DDPA also contains language regarding reparations. Also, Durban really lifted up the gender dimension of racial discrimination. This program today will explain key provisions of the DDPA and share information about the drafting of the DDPA and current efforts by powerful nations to suppress the document. I'm pleased to have three powerful comrades here today to address these issues. They are Adjoa Aiyetoro, Roger Wareham, and Esther Stanford Kosei. Let's begin with Adjoa. Adjoa Aiyetoro is Professor Emerita at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, William H. Bowen School of Law. In addition to being a law professor, she's worked as an attorney with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and ACLU National Prison Project. Adjoa has extensive experience working domestically and internationally to obtain remedies for historic and present-day wrongs to people of color, women, prisoners, and other oppressed groups. Adjoa represented the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in preparatory meetings for the World Conference Against Racism and at the conference itself, and served as co-chair of the African and African Descendant Caucus. She represented the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law at the UN Women's Conference in Beijing in 1995 and at the 2005 year meeting in New York. Adjoa is a lifetime member of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and has served as co-chairperson of its board and as its national director. As co-chair of NCBL, Adjoa was a founding member of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, or NCOBRA. She represented NCOBRA and NCBL on the Reparations Coordinating Committee and as co-chair with Charles Ogletree and Randall Robinson. Adjoa served as co-counsel in the landmark reparations case filed by the committee seeking reparations for the survivors and their descendants of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Since retiring in 2016, she continues to be active in both NCBL and in NCOBRA. Adjoa graduated cum laude from St. Louis University School of Law in 1978. She was inducted into the law school's Hall of Fame in February of this year. Adjoa, can you please walk us through your work with the caucuses, explaining what the caucuses were, and then also talk about development of the language on crimes against humanity and reparations?
Okay, thank you. And could you tell me how much time I have? Because I can run my mouth.
10 to 15 minutes, please. Okay. Go ahead, go in depth. I just want to say that after, which I've shared with you guys, after hosting the side event at the Permanent Forum meeting in Geneva, the question that I kept getting from people was, what's in the DDPA? Tell us about it. So people really want to hear about this. So this is the focus of this meeting.
Okay, well, thank you so much, one, for inviting me to be a part of this and for organizing it. And I greet my co-panelists. I have not seen Esther Stanford live in many, many years, but she's fabulous. And of course, off and on, I've worked with Roger, and I want to lift Roger up just for a second. Roger has worked on these issues at the UN and the international level for many, many years. And many of us, when we became part of this, benefited from his work that he had done to bring these issues of racism, race reparations, and all of that to the fore within the international community. And I think sometimes we don't take the time to say thank you to each other for their work. And so I want to, on not just my personal knowledge and behalf, but on behalf of our movement, thank Roger for all the years that he has worked in the international arena, coming back, telling us what's going on, taking us forward. So thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
So I want to start with, I guess it's kind of interesting how to start. I got to Durban, well, I didn't get, I should have looked up each session, but I went to the first preparatory meeting, as it's indicated when Kerry read my bio. I was representing the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. I was also active in that organization, and they asked me if I would represent them in the preparatory meetings and at WCAR, and I was ecstatic to do so because NCBL had no money to send me. so that was a way for me to participate fully, and they paid for all of the preparatory meetings in the Durban and all of that, which all of us know as organizers. That's significant. But they're also a good group. I don't want to say that they weren't. They were a good group, but I wanted to share that in doing that, they embraced this WCAR process. Long and short of it is, when we first got to the first preparatory meeting, there were quite a few countries, African, Caribbean, represented there. I remember the strong Brazilian contingent. There's Uruguay. There were other, African groups, Ghana, whatever, all of that. And we began to talk and meet, and as a part of that process, we became a caucus. And I can't remember now, and Roger knows my memory is like, oh, okay, fine. What did that happen, really? But the caucus process was set up by the preparatory meetings with the NGOs, and people were in their caucus, like we were African and African descendant countries representing African descendant groups and countries. There was a migrant caucus. It was Indigenous Peoples Caucus. There were so many other caucuses where people were coming together that had similar interests. And that process led to 3 of us being chosen, the African Descendant Caucus, to co-lead the caucus. And that primarily was much like a co-chair. All of us have been co-chairs, where you kind of facilitate, you bring the issues together, you make sure people are there who have the information. I remember having to decide, what other caucus do we want to reach out to work with us. The biggest thing for me as the work proceeded from the preparatory meetings and to the conference, which was a year or more, I can't remember exactly, but more than a year of meetings, was what do we focus on? And, everybody came there that were representing the African Descendant Caucus with reparations on their mind, right? They were in various forms, working in their own countries for reparations, for recognition of the injuries caused by slavery, by colonialism. And so there was not a struggle within the caucus at all to begin to focus on those issues. We also met a couple of times at least with some of the African countries, particularly. I remember the lead of the Nigerian delegation came to one of our preparatory meetings to talk about it. That was closer to, and I think Roger was there, but that was closer to the actual document, closer to Durban, so to speak. Might have been right before Durban. And to dialogue, and at that point, they were actually trying to get us to see what language made sense, that they wanted. Of course, they were different than us in the sense that they were in the political process on the floor, so to speak. And so, but there was this interaction. The other thing that I thought was important with our caucus is that we saw fairly early on that we needed to interact with other caucuses to get them to support our view on reparations, particularly. And so we began meeting with the various caucuses, and one is very vivid in my mind. One of the responses from the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, which was they did not want to have reparations be something put on them, because their demand was for their treaty rights, their rights to their land that was stolen. And so we had several meetings and interactions with them in order to come to the understanding, I wasn't even in agreement, that we would not intentionally nor try not to unconsciously load them in with our demand for reparations, because at that point, they felt, and many Indigenous peoples groups still feel, and I respect their view, that it's not reparations they want their land back, their sovereignty. So we did that kind of work. We had lots of discussions. We saw differences among us as well as similarities. There were differences in their approach. For example, I remember the Brazilian group were at a different place with how they felt they could negotiate with their government. They had a different entryway to working nationally with their government. The long and short of it, though, is that we all very strongly, all of the countries in the African Descendant Caucus focused on reparations in some way, whether it was a colonialism or slavery. And so we did a lot of groundwork, not only with other caucuses, but with getting the word out to whatever government delegates that our caucus members had contact with. One of the things I want to say about the caucus was we also did a lot of planning around activism. It wasn't simply, let's just sit and talk and all of that. How do we bring forth in view of the governments? Because at the same time the preparatory meetings were going on, the governments were also meeting. And so how do we let them know where we are and what we're doing and what we want? So we did a lot of thinking about that. One thing I do, it just for me is sort of like the cap on our activism, was we organized a major demonstration right before the government conference was going to open in Durban. And that demonstration included many of the caucuses. And then people joined. It was a marching demonstration, and I would be lying if I told you I knew where we started the march, but I know where we ended, right? But we marched, and we had the caucuses of many of the caucuses were with us, and our demand was reparations. And Danny Glover was there, and he was our kind of like a keynote speaker, short but good. And what it dawned on me then, and it continues to dawn on me now, what Charlene Mitchell used to say, many of you may not know her, but I'm not going to take I got a few minutes left to tell you who she's a major organizer who died recently. And she said, unity plus struggle equals victory. Unity plus struggle equals victory. And that was kind of what that, unity plus organization plus struggle equals victory. And that kind of was what I think was brought out when we got the language. We talked a lot about reparations, specific language, not necessarily specific language, but reparations, the demands. We did talk within our group about the kinds of things that we would want in terms of reparations. We talked around about the crimes against humanity that were both slavery and colonialism. I think, and I don't want to steal Roger's thunder, that Roger did a lot of work with the countries themselves to kind of mold that and get that kind of languaging in the document. Even though we did, like I said, we met with the Nigerian government. It might have been some others that I'm forgetting we met with and we talked about it. We were invited as a caucus to make a presentation to the UN government body. Roger hadn't gotten there yet, so they voted on me. And so I made that presentation, making the language, talking about what we had been discussing. One thing that really touches my heart was that later on, Fidel Castro repeated back using some of our language in what he presented back to the body. So it showed that they were listening, not just Fidel, they were listening. I guess I would like to end on the importance, it seemed to me, and I have Kerry asked us to pull the exact language from the documents. So in the world, the WCAR declaration, it's paragraph 13 in the declaration. It says, we acknowledge the slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, were appalling tragedies in the history of humanity, not only because of their horror and barbarism, but also in terms of their magnitude, organized nature, and especially their negation of the essence of the victims, and further acknowledge that slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity and should always have been so, especially the transatlantic slave trade, and are among the major sources and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and that Africans and people of African descent, Asians and people of Asian descent, and indigenous peoples were victims of these acts and continue to be victims of their consequences. In the program of action there, under Africans and people of African descent, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's 14 paragraphs. It was 10 paragraphs. They talk about urging states to facilitate participation of African descendants, people in all areas of life, financial reparations. They talk about developing ways in which those financial reparations could be developed. They urge that attention be put on particularly women and young males of African descent, given that racism affects them more deeply, placing them in a more marginalized and disadvantaged situation. I'm not going to read all of them. It's 14 paragraphs, but they outline the reparations forms that should be considered by, should be actually done, not considered by states who are the perpetrators of these crimes against humanity. The last thing I want to say is it seems to me that the work we did, and I think the NGO and the caucuses and our African and African descendant caucus with the additional work of others, and I did point out earlier, I think the leadership of Roger, even before we got there and while we were there, is significant. The U.S. ambassadors, and I did a open letter that is being circulated somewhere. I have no idea where it is now. But the U.S. from the beginning was resistant, and that's a nice word to say, to our work around reparations. We were told by the ambassador that was a leader of the delegation at the PrEP meetings, and I can't remember her name, and Roger said he couldn't remember her name. I'm hoping maybe he's remembered it since we talked, but she was originally from Canada, but she was a US citizen and had been made an ambassador. And she, we went to her, and she almost felt like, we felt like she was running. I mean, that was my sense. I won't say what anybody else thought. But she said flatly that the U.S. would not deal with reparations. No, and we got no movement from there. And then to me, the sad thing is that the U.S. flat out just lied about why they were withdrawing, because they were really trying to escape and not deal with, and they saw there was a government supporting issues of slavery and reparations, needing reparations for slavery. And so they hitched their wagon, so to speak, to a proposed language that they said, the Israelis said was anti-Semitic, which was actually relating Zionism to racism, but that language never got in the document. And so for me, as a US citizen, as a woman of African descent, as in the US, as a participant and a very, active participant in these preparatory meetings and the conference, I feel that it's so important that our representative to the public forum not be misled by some statement that the US will in fact do something else for us better than what the documents have said, and therefore to put aside these documents. I say in my open letter, and I'm saying it now, let's build on these documents. They have not, and I think Roger's going to go into it some, they have not been fully implemented. And there have been attacks on it. Roger will talk some about that, I hope he will. But let's not do the US's work for them in denying the injury they have caused, the crimes they have committed against people of African descent, and allow them to, for whatever reasons, to be able to get the person who is a permanent representative to the forum to support the discarding of these documents as opposed to building on these documents. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adjoa. That was excellent. Okay, so we're going to turn to Roger Wareham now. And so Roger, by the way, is not going to talk very much about the attacks. Esther will talk some more about that. But let me introduce Roger to you. Roger Wareham has been a lawyer and political activist for over 5 decades. He's a member of the December 12th movement, an organization of African people which organizes in the Black and Latino community around human rights violations. Roger is the International Secretary General of the International Association Against Torture, a non-governmental organization in consultative status before the UN. Since 1989, he's presented evidence of human rights violations facing people of color in the US and other parts of the world at assemblies of the UN. His work was instrumental in having the first UN Special Rapporteur on Racism conduct the first UN investigation of the US in history. Roger was an active organizer of and a leading participant in the UN World Conference Against Racism. He was a lead attorney in the historic lawsuit filed in the United States Federal District Courts in 2002, suing private corporations for reparations due to the descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. In June 2012, and again in September 2014, he led a delegation of the Pan-African Solidarity Hague Committee, which presented a petition to the International Criminal Court charging NATO members with war crimes and crimes against humanity in their interventions in Libya, Haiti, and Cote d'Ivoire. Roger, can you talk about the work you did with governments to secure the language on crimes against humanity and on reparations? And also feel free to include any other background information that you think would be useful for people to know.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this. Let me start with this quote that most people are familiar with. Malcolm X said, "Of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research." And I think it's important to re-emphasize that for us to understand what the DDPA represented and why it is such a victory. And in terms of Adjoa's introduction and thanks, and I accept the work that we've done, or the work that I've done, I accept that on behalf of the organization that I represent, because I'm not there as an individual, and that sets the parameters of how we, what we do there. And it was really interesting enough, because we started going to the UN in 1989 because of our commitment to carrying out Malcolm's mandate in terms of putting our struggle on the international agenda. So I would start with that once, historically, in about 1994, shortly after President Mandela was elected president in South Africa, the Western group of countries in the United Nations mounted a movement to take the question of racism off of the agenda of human rights. It's almost as if, once something had changed in South Africa, there was no more racism in the world, because they knew that if they continued with it, they would have to confront what they've done. And so we pushed for, within that body, we pushed for there to be another World Conference Against Racism. There had been one in 78, another in 80, when both apartheid South Africa, Rhodesia, were still, which became Zimbabwe, which was then just, referred to as Rhodesia, or issues. We fought and pushed back, and so they backed off from trying to remove racism from the agenda. There was resistance to holding another world conference, and at the point in 1997, when it was decided, when the GA decided, that there would be a World Conference Against Racism, they expanded the context of it. The previous World Conferences had been World Conference Against Racism and Racial Discrimination. The one in Durban in 2001 was going to be the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, which is almost every human rights violation in the world. Always understanding that their objective was to diminish the emphasis on racism. We as an organization, once it had been decided that there would be this third World Conference, our agenda in that was to push forward the question of reparations, and we framed it in three issues. One was the recognition of the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and colonialism as crimes against humanity, because they're all apart. You can't separate colonialism and the slave trade. The second was reparations due to the descendants of the victims of these crimes against humanity. And third was the acknowledgement, the recognition of the economic basis of racism, to understand that this was not simply some sort of psychological derangement, that there's a real concrete material basis for where the ideology of racism came and why it's perpetuated to this day. And that was what we took to the World Conference. I mean, that's what we took to the World Conference, but that's what we took to the prep comms. I think people who aren't familiar with the United Nations have to understand that prior to any World Conference, they have preparatory commissions, usually regional, each of the 5 groups in the United Nations: Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the Asian, North America. I'm still losing on one of them. And all of those are related geographically. There's another group called the WEO group, the Western European and Other group. And that group has no geographical relationship. It's the Western European countries, it's Canada, it's New Zealand, it's the United States, it's Israel. And the only commonality they have is that they were all settler states. They were settler states or settler colonies. And that's their commonality. It's not geography, it's political economic history. So the WEO group is the one who's, throughout this whole process, has been opposing the question of having a world conference, and certainly the issue of reparations. As Adjoa laid out at the first PrepCom, the woman representing the United States said, look, if there's anything, the term they use is compensation. They couldn't even form their mouths to say the word reparations. If compensation is going to be an issue here, the United States is going to withdraw. We're not going to participate. And that's the threat they always held over South Africa, which was hosting the event. Said it was that if we, the Western countries, don't participate, this won't be a real world conference. It won't have any legitimacy. And that was a threat that they kept holding over them in terms of whether they would participate or not. And as you know, Adjoa's memory of the caucuses is somewhat accurate, somewhat inaccurate, but you know, look, we're both getting older. But certainly, what we wanted to do when we were participating was to have the people of African descent who were coming from around the world, you know, not just the U.S. but the Caribbean and South and Central and South America, and they all came with very legitimate demands in terms of how racism, racial discrimination affected them in their countries, which is what we fought to have all of them put those three issues that I talked about initially at the top of their agenda, to understand that from our experience, because we had participated in the UN World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993. And what we learned from that was that everybody brings grievances, but if there's no real focus, then what you have is you have a grievance session and you don't see anything reflected in the final document that really addresses that. And so that's why we were pushing for this question of the crimes against humanity and reparations with all the African descendant groups, and that people came together and agreed on that. You know, for all those folks who say nationally, locally, that Black folks can't get together, that put the lie to that, because people understood the importance of how reparations would affect whatever their particular situation was in their country, and also that the designation of crimes against humanity set an international legal basis, because crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations, which means that whenever the countries can no longer bring that up as well, it's too late, you waited too long. And that's what the real significance of the DDPA is, that you have an international declaration that these are crimes against humanity. So that's how we approached it. Also, at world conferences, usually by the time the World Conference comes, it's really pro forma, because they've had PrepComs. There's a final document that's really been agreed to even before people get to the World Conference. And so you're really just going through talking about some stuff and different things like that. This one was different particularly because of the interference by the United States and Canada. There was no one document agreed upon by the time we got to Durban, which meant that you were almost starting from scratch when you got to Durban. The Latin American and Caribbean grouping, which the United States and Canada are not a part of, the United States and Canada really bogarted their way into their PrepCom in order so that they could water down the language around reparations and crimes against humanity. And once they were able to water that out, at the point in time at that PrepCom in Santiago, Chile in 2001, the US and Canada said, "Oh well, it's almost like we were just playing. We're not going to participate in it." So there was no consensus document. They tried to do the same in Africa, and they were unsuccessful. The Dakar Declaration, which came out of at the African PrepCom, was very clear around the crimes against humanity, included colonialism. It was a very, very strong statement. And then in the European statement, it was, once again, it was what you expect out of Western Europe. So that's the background of us coming to Durban. Our particular organization, December 12th movement and the National Black United Front, had organized a grouping of NGOs mainly from around the US, and NGOs and individuals from around the US, and also the Caribbean and some from Europe. We call the Durban 400 because these are people who were coming to Durban to lobby these states around the language we felt that we knew had to be the outcome of the document. as background, when we first went to the United Nations in 1989, one of the Cuban delegates, who was just a genius in terms of diplomacy, Miguel Alfonso Martinez, said, you know what, we know your background. This is a different forum. In the United Nations, it's not the size of the demonstration or the deployment of forces that are going to determine what comes out in those final documents. It may be the placement of a period or a semicolon that people will have. There'll be all-night sessions around that, because you're providing a document that is going to guide what people are going to deal with. So when we got to Durban, that was the fight in terms of that. The NGO meeting that occurred simultaneously is very important in terms of providing background and a source of what is the world feeling that it would influence what's going on inside of the UN. But the work inside the UN, which was really collaring the different delegations, speaking with the different delegates, meeting with the African group, because the African group was the group that was really the force behind there being a Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Had there not been an African group, that wouldn't have happened. The Caribbean, particularly the Caribbean countries, were very strong. So then it was really a question of how do you get the other countries that might be wavering around it? But there was really no resistance, because the majority of the UN are developing countries. They're this quote unquote used to be called the third world. They are the victims of colonialism and racism. So there was no real fight around that. The fight was what was going to happen with the Western European and other group. The United States still were running this thing around. It's anti-Semitic. When I hope people take the time, just look at the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, you'll see that there's nothing in there anti-Semitic. As a matter of fact, there's in paragraph, I think 63, they recognize Palestinians' right to self-determination and Israel's right to self-determination. So that had come as a strategic compromise by the Palestinians, who said, we are not going to insist on our issue being raised if it's going to lead to the detriment of this whole push around reparations and crimes against humanity. So they backed up off of that. So that threw out the actual basis for what the US was trying to say they were withdrawing from, because the US did not want to say they were withdrawing because we don't believe that Black people in the United States are due reparations. But nevertheless, they did withdraw in the first week of the delegation, running the same thing around Israel, which just is not true. So the fight then around the Western European and other group was this language, and that fight went on. Literally, the conference was supposed to end, I think, at 6 p.m. on a Friday evening, and it went till 12 midnight the next day before they could finally agree on the language that we see in the document, and is a reflection of the strength of the organizing that we as civil society did, of the political savvy of the African group and their willingness not to back down, because this isn't all, I remember one of the South African delegates said to me, he said, you will not believe the amount of pressure that the United States is putting on us. They're talking about treaties and loans and all sorts of things that if we don't back down off of this, we're going to feel the wrath of them. And we can see that today in terms of the position the US has taken around countries that haven't jumped on the Ukraine bandwagon. So it's just that same kind of under the table events, not negotiating, pressure that's being brought to affect a change that they want. So once Durban ended, the Western European and other group, who, and I know I'm getting close to my time, from that point in time, they have taken every step, and Esther will go into some of it, but from the day it ended, the next day they were trying to really disappear the DDPA. They were trying to disappear the DDPA. The United States' position has still been that it's an anti-Semitic document. They keep raising that. When there was a follow-up in 2009, the first Durban follow-up, which should have been in 2006, Mary Robinson, who had been the head of the Human Rights Office when the Durban was held, made a specific statement that she took exception to the fact that people were trying to characterize the DDPA as a anti-Semitic document, because that wasn't it. But what the real issue was around Durban, the crimes against humanity. So that's the way we have to look at it. The one other point. To this, and I think, you know, Esther will get into it in terms of, to this day, what we're looking at. I think the point I'm trying to get across to folks who are not familiar with this and the importance of the history is that sometimes you can determine the importance of what you're doing by the resistance from those who would be affected by it. The Western group and the United States in particular have fought the DDPA tooth and nail. And so we expect that. What we hoped would happen with the development of the permanent forum on people of African descent was that the permanent forum of people of African descent would be complementary to and a part of the DDPA, not being projected as an alternative to the DDPA, because the DDPA sets out a number of different programs and tasks that could be done locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally around the whole issue of racism, programs that can be taken to really affect a change in the conditions and quality of life of people of African descent who've been affected by the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and the continuing expression of that right through to 2023. And so, and I can only contrast the U.S. to this very moment opposition to the DDPA with its position it's taken around the permanent forum, where at the just ended session of the Human Rights Council, the U.S. ambassador just spoke about how great the permanent forum was and how we've made contributions to it, and we really wish the success of it. And I think that's what we have to bear in mind when, well, why is the U.S. so embracing the permanent forum while at the same time dismissing a continuous campaign to just make the DDPA disappear, when the essence of the DDPA is the recognition of crimes against humanity and that reparations are due. I think if we don't have that perspective, then we won't understand what is actually going on right now in 2023, and we will lose our bearings, and we will lose the results of a very historic battle that Black people internationally have won, that the DDPA represents that. And sometimes we don't appreciate those things until we lose them. So I'll stop at that point and deal with whatever questions and stuff we have later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger. Again, just excellent. Okay, so let us move to, hang on. All right. Let's move to Esther now, who's going to address really the efforts to suppress the DDPA and advocacy. But let me introduce Esther. Esther Stanford Kosei is a Pan-Africanist, jurisconsult, decolonial reparationist, and community advocate specializing in the critical legal practice of law as resistance, as an approach to social movement lawyering, earth jurisprudence, and eco-socio-legal transformation from below. In this regard, Esther is engaged in reparations policy development, research, and movement building under the auspices of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, the Stop the Mangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, and the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. Esther is also the co-chair of the International Affairs Commission of INCOBRA. So I've asked Esther to talk in depth about efforts to suppress the DDPA over the years, as well as advocacy that many of us engage in to defend and promote the DDPA. Esther?
Thank you, Kerry, and to everyone, and also greeting my fellow panelists, Roger and Adjoa. It's great to be here. I didn't go to Durban, let me just say that. But I have been involved very vociferously in its follow-ups including the African and African Descendants World Conference Against Racism that was held in Barbados in October 2002, which there are very mixed views about. But suffice to say, from the time that Durban happened, it's well reported that there were the two main issues that even at the time the conference was going on, threatened to derail the conference, if I can put it in those terms. And those issues have already been mentioned. The question of equating Zionism with racism, and allegations of attacks on the state of Israel, but also the huge issue of reparations for slavery in particular. And of course, the mobilization around recognizing slavery as a crime against humanity, and also attempts to also similarly recognize colonialism. So I think in sort of giving a perspective on the fight back on the DDPA, we must recognize the significance of these issues. And Roger kind of highlighted how we can gauge that by looking at what it is that you're not supposed to do, you know, the resistance to the DDPA, and also the reasons that are given, but that are, as has been said, because certain language didn't even make it into the consensus documents, then actually there's a lot of focus in trying to bury and suppress the DDPA. And we have to really look at things geopolitically, I would say. And as African people, people of African heritage and ancestry, we don't always do geopolitics very well in terms of looking at our collective national interests as a people that are transnational and transcend borders, the current borders that we currently reside in, and looking at how we are able to enforce our will and our geopolitical interests worldwide. And I think that's really at the heart of some of this resistance to the DDPA, because it is seen as such a threat. And because we haven't been able to flex our global might and our power base, not only within the United States of America, but also globally, then this is being missed. And in particular, obviously, Roger has mentioned the Western European group, and particularly nations like the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and Israel have really been leading the charge to bury the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. And again, I feel that it's incumbent upon us to not just go with the so-called mainstream, white stream corporate narratives, but to really look at what were the gains that were made in Durban, and even some of the wording in the documents, the sort of historic nature of some of the wording in the documents, and the recognition of our rights as African people and people of African descent, but not just us, in truth. You know, it recognized Asians and people of Asian descent, indigenous people, Roma people, refugees, migrants. Attention's already been paid to women, questions of intersectional or so-called multiple discrimination, and a whole plethora of other issues that really gained prominence at Durban. So we have to look at the real threat now, that the mobilization towards Durban and across, you know, not just civil society, but how civil society actors were able to work cooperatively with state actors and governments, trying to assert our interests as African people worldwide. And for me, that is the #1 issue, irrespective of whatever else gets said, and however other many news reports there are around why this isn't being accepted. And so for me, it's also about some of the language. We know there had to be compromises made. So that paragraph 13 that recognizes that slavery was a crime against humanity, and then the wording that was added later, I believe by Egypt, it's reported, that sort of watered it down, you know, to words such as "and should always have been so." This is really an indication of some of the real concerns, because the document itself was good and was historic in terms of the language and the negotiations around what language should go into it. But more importantly, that I think from my perspective that we need to focus on is how did the achievements, which we must recognize as being achievements at Durban, how did they come about? And what was the role of civil society and the masses in actually bringing to bear and enforcing our will so that even state actors felt that they could flex their muscles? State actors from some of our countries in the global south, in particular in Africa and the Caribbean, that we know have historically been marginalized within so-called United Nations and the international arena. And it's important to note that from the time Durban happened, there's now been 4 conferences. So there was Durban 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first one in 2009, the second in 2011, sorry, the third in 2011, and then Durban 4, which was in 2021. And at each of those conferences, there have been boycotts, mobilizing. The US in particular has been very significant in this regard, obviously working with Israel to and supported by countries like the UK to condemn the whole Durban process and every single issue and gain that came out of it that both Adjoa and Roger have both spoken to. And so in 2021, when it was the Durban 4 conference, there was a boycott of apparently 40 countries. And this was quite significant because that was more than double the amount of countries that had boycotted Durban 3 in 2011. And countries, like the United Kingdom have also gone hand in hand with the US and Israel to suppress the voices of African people worldwide. And in this regard, I think it's really important that we examine also the role that some of our own people play, especially when they are state actors who are, working for part of the institutions and machineries of states in some of the nations that have been leading the boycotts of the DDPA. So I particularly remember being in the UK, the leader of the House of Lords at the time, Baroness Valerie Amos, an African Guyanese, as I said, leader of the House of Lords, who was responsible for actually promoting the UK government's perspective at Durban, who didn't want to agree to slavery being a crime against humanity, and actually lobbied other European Union countries. Obviously, the UK has now left the European Union, partially because it doesn't want to be held accountable for its human rights violations that are perpetrated not only on people of African heritage and ancestry, but other colonized and oppressed peoples around the world. So that's why geopolitics matters, power matters, and how we build our power, how we're able to mobilize our people, and also the impact that this suppression of the DDPA, and I have to say, going with that, the complicity of some state actors who are racialized as being Black or of African heritage, even in countries in, say, South America, say Costa Rica. We have to talk about that. We have to tell the truth about how we've come to be where we are, because it's not just about who is the Western European group, who are their allies, how do they succeed? And if we don't have these honest conversations in our communities, we will also miss some of the resistance and also some of the challenges that we face in actually enforcing our will internationally. And that goes to other issues in the way that, as I said, not only how we may become complicit, and I'm thinking in particular in relation to how processes get instituted which are covers for suppressing the DDPA and the whole Durban process. So for instance, the recognition of the 31st of August being an International Day for People of African Descent, which was the date that the original Durban conference, World Conference Against Racism, started. And so there are these very subtle ways that alternative agendas that get promoted by countries where we have people leading, people who are Afro-descendant, African heritage and ancestry leading, that end up being covers for an agenda that is really suppressing our people's voice and our agency. And we have to recognize African descendant, Afro-descendant complicity today around this whole Durban agenda, because we have to challenge ourselves and recognize that sometimes we may end up taking actions that go against our people's interests geopolitically. And that has been very much the case in terms of the fight back that has been leveled in these 40 countries that have boycotted the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. So apart from needing to pay attention to geopolitics, there's also a need for, there's been lots of resistance, let me just say that. And a lot of this resistance has tended to center around the United Nations and various kind of sessions of the Human Rights Councils and the Working Group of Experts of People of African Descent, which again is an outcome of that whole DDPA process. But I have to say that even though a lot of activism is happening, and I recognize that, the missing link is the masses are not on board. The masses are not engaged. And the fact that many of those who waged the struggle to even get the DDPA consensus document, there are many activists who have come on board later who do not know the history that has been shared here today. People are not educated about this document. If we live in countries of Western Europe, North America, et cetera, where we're constantly hearing this document being put down, that impacts on civil society organizations that may or may not get funded. And we end up all in small and big ways being complicit in the burying of this agenda. And so we mustn't underestimate the power of the forces for change that brought about the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. It wasn't just people who were actually there lobbying in the halls of the UN, but it was the masses who were on the streets, who were mobilizing, who were engaged in community-based activism and organizing across civil society that also mattered. So we need to get back to that mass conscientization and education and mobilization in defense of the DDPA. And also look at how we can build a united front again, especially an anti-colonial united front from below, amongst people, nations and countries who are committed to the DDPA. We talk about those that have boycotted it. Why don't we focus on those nations that haven't? And especially those of us that are in nations that do, let us not underestimate our own power to resist governments, including governments that we may be citizens of in terms of those countries. We mustn't underestimate our power to be that change from below and connecting, globally. So locally and the global together is going to be a key part of that. And a big part of enforcing our will geopolitically, as Adjoa spoke to, is the importance of forming coalitions of the willing across different interest groups who also have a stake in this agenda. So internationalist solidarity is really, really key in terms of enforcing our will globally on defense of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. We must pay attention to what's going on in the world and the rise of the BRICS nations. And just yesterday it was reported that there's another 30 nations that wants to join it. So even what I'm trying to say here is that the power base that has been wielded by the Western European group is diminishing geopolitically and globally. And we have to be able to see when this is our time to once again rise again. And so building this coalition of the willing, this united front today from civil society is going to be really, really key. But ultimately, in all things, organization decides everything. So we have to organize, we have to keep the pressure going, and we have to do much more and redouble our efforts to ensure that when we have representatives that are going into arenas of the United Nations, that they are going with our people's mandate. Because what's happened is that we have a lot of individuals, you know, I'm not talking obviously about people who've already spoken on this platform, but the success of our people's struggle means that we begin to see NGOization, and we begin to see careerist diplomats and so forth, and international representatives who go into these spaces, but not necessarily with the people's mandate, with the people's kind of voices and support. And so it means that our advocacy in these spaces will be muted and won't be as effective if we cannot show the popular base of that we are speaking from. So I think I'll stop here because I'm conscious of the time, and I've probably gone over time. Thank you.
Oh, Esther, just excellent as always. Thank you very much. So, you know, we are over the hour, but if people are willing, we can stay on a little bit longer because, you know, number one, I definitely want to take questions if there are any. And number two, I have a comrade on the Zoom who has a personal situation that I've asked him to share with you all. So, okay, let's take one or two questions, and then we're going to turn to Jan after. Okama, you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Blessings. Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to say that it is so important to have this conversation. And I think, you know, any group, anybody who is going as part of this movement to participate in this forum should have the Durban Declaration as a background. So there should be a backgrounder. There should be a background document that everybody should be referencing. Everybody, it should be mandated that anybody who is participating in any of these forums should reference that document, which means that they need to educate themselves about the movement, where it started from, and what is the ultimate purpose of participating in this. We do indeed tend to forget because a lot of new people come along and they're just interested in going to these forums. They're just interested in, you know, in being part of, you know, the UN system. And they don't know anything about what the eventual goal, what's the purpose, and where we need to be. So I think if we can have a way of just highlighting that, it will help to, you know, bring more people in line with the original intention, and therefore how we need to walk this talk. The other aspect is we should have people within the movement who are knowledgeable about the UN. I used to work in the UN, and I managed the UN volunteer program. So I have an in-depth understanding of, you know, how we should be aligning ourselves. I left the UN to start my own nonprofit organization because I wanted, from an inside out and outside in perspective, to be able to get our people prepared for partnerships with the UN. And I don't feel that, you know, we have that knowledge in the system. People often don't know how to negotiate or what to negotiate for, and therefore we go into this without even a paper, without a proposal, with nothing. We're just going in to talk. We're going in to listen. But if you know how the UN functions, and we have our allies in there, we should come out with wins all the time. So this is just something I want to put on the table, that we need our knowledgeable people on the UN intelligence, the high level delegations. What are they looking for? And what can we come out that we can use to hold the UN or the permanent, the secretariat accountable for next time? So thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you. Adjoa, if you want to wait 1 sec, I see your hand is raised. I just want to give Amy a chance to ask. Amy? Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. So I am a master's student, and I'm working on a thesis that looks at the negotiations that happened with the DDPA and also ICER, the Race Convention. And one of the arguments that I've been running through was that one of the reason why the United States signed ICER and did not endorse the DDPA was because of the language between the two documents. So while the DDPA deals with systemic racism, ICER has a broader language on race. And this is one of the arguments that has been put forward in kind of differentiating between how the US reacted on both documents. So I just wanted to get the panelist perspective on this argument, or is this a valid argument? Is there something more that these conversations are missing? Thank you so much.
Roger, Adjoa, Esther, you want to respond?
I would just very quickly, you're absolutely right. As I said, the DDPA represents a cross to a vampire as far as the United States is concerned. The ICER had been, I'm trying to remember what year the US finally ratified the ICER. Yeah, but it had been around for many, many years. And I think it was really, they had to succumb to the pressure of, they were so intransigent on everything else that they always pushed themselves in the United Nations as, we are the standard bearers. And one of the things that we started to do when we first went there was to begin to point out the double standard that existed between what the US says it does and what it actually does. Because this was before Google. We used to spend months researching stuff and taking stuff there so countries could see this is what's going on, that the United States isn't representative by Bill Cosby and Oprah Winfrey and the Dream Team, that the conditions of the mass of our people is significantly different and closer to the standard of living of the developing countries than it is to people who supposedly are citizens in the same geographic location.
Yeah, I was in Geneva when the United States, ICER was meeting, and the United States had submitted their first report. They were intransigent in terms of submitting the reports, number one. They joined late and they weren't submitting their reports on time. And I was in Geneva when they had a review of their first report, which was delayed. What the response to their first report was that, the United States, started listing all the laws they had against discrimination. And the response was, we're not asking for your laws, we're asking for the actual conduct within the country. I'm paraphrasing that, but that was basically what they were saying. So the United States has consistently hid behind laws that they say they have in place. I mean, we know those laws are hard fought for. So, but they have not done the implementation to the extent that they have even made any super major inroads into the current issues facing people of African descent, Africans, people of color, whatever. So that's my response to that. had something else, but maybe let's see if Esther has a response to that. And then I did have something.
No, go ahead. You've both answered it. Thanks.
Okay, so one of the concerns I have, and I really appreciate the comments of both my co-panelists, you know, I think they're both brilliant. You know, I'm biased, but what can I say? But I do think that what we have responsibility, and when I say we, I mean everybody on this call, not just the panelists, to really begin to break down what it means that we need to be doing on the ground. I know this is the pre-forum meeting, and I again applaud Kerry for organizing this. I know some of the people are part of delegations, I know with in COBRA at least, that will be part of that discussion. But I think one of the suggestions I had is that after this forum, where, you know, Kerry's doing a good job of educating and all people who are going, is that, for example, in COBRA's international commission, which Esther co-chairs, and maybe others, that we began to hold small not trainings even, just to be able to educate people so that we're doing something before we get to this forum next time. We need, and things that are doable, small steps, because so many times, and this doesn't happen all the time, don't get me wrong, but so many times we have these fabulous meetings and fora, and then we don't hear anything else until right before the next one, whenever that is. So I would just ask that, and I am an active member of NCOBRA, so I'll call out NCOBRA, that we do some, and NCBL as well, call out NCBL. I see Ron is on with the international section as well as Kerry. That we begin to really break some of this down and have meaningful discussions and strategy building, not just talking heads, but strategy. What can we do? I wrote an article, and I'm not going to go into detail about it. Anybody who wants it, put in chat, and I can see if I can get it to you. But one of the things that I think we talk about, but in some ways talk around, is the depth of white supremacy. The depth of it that is in the bones of this country and probably Britain. I don't live there, but I've been there, and other white countries, that the falsity of the racial hierarchy that was created in 1500s, that is the ground of the United States, I know, because the United States, you know, was formed on that. And I think, although I agree with almost all of the dialogue that are coming from my colleagues, the basis of it is so deep that we need to understand these people are fighting for their lives. They're fighting for a lie. The lie that they were better. The lie that they, and all of that. I don't need to, I just, it pisses me off, excuse me. But I just think we need to really begin to focus on the understanding of this. It's not just, we're not just fighting at a superficial 20th century, 21st century level. You know, how do we uproot the and when we talk about Black folk or other people of color working with them, they buy the lie too. How do we deal with that? And I think all the work we've done is great. Please don't hear me diminishing anything. I started off thanking Roger for his work on the international level. The sister who talked about we need someone to teach, we need, you know, Roger does that, you know, and D12 and others do it too, but helps us walk through the UN process. And not that we don't need more, but I do think that we need to begin to focus on how do you uproot? It's like uprooting a plant that is so old that you got to figure out how to uproot it. And I think we need to have those kinds of discussions as well, because this is not just capitalism, which is a major part of it, don't get me wrong. This is a deep-rooted sense of superiority. That's a lie. They created it and they're defending it. And some of us believe it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Adjoa. Powerful Powerful remarks. Okay, so I do not think that there are any more questions right now. So I'd like to.
There's Brother Maynard. Brother Maynard has his hand up.
No, that was just a clap for Adjoa's presentation there. That's all.
Okay.
Keep talking,
right.
Adjoa.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, are there any? All right, Paula. Yeah. And by the way, Paula, I saw in the chat you were asking about the links. So I can send you all the chat, and yes, this is being recorded right now, so you can also receive the recording.
Great,
but the transcription is not working, so sorry about that.
No, there's just so much in this discussion, again, to come back to, and resources I want to follow up, so thanks. I look forward to it. Thank you all.
Can I just say that I really support Adjoa's suggestion, proposal that we find a way to strategize, and to say that I've got colleagues, I've got my co-chair for INCOBRA International Affairs Commission on the call, Brother Morgan, there's Brother Maynard, there's Baba Shabaka, and probably others from the International Affairs Commission. So I know that they would support that, because we have began doing some quarterly workshops, and I really welcome the opportunity to work more closely with the NCBL as well, and yourself, Roger, so that we can rebuild, reconnect, because the connections are there, but we need to reconnect into the different power bases that we have, and our people's power to be able to support those of you who are waging these struggles. And I think the other point that's been highlighted in the chat that I forgot to mention is that there's it's not just suppression, there's also the intimidation of activists who are championing this agenda. And of course, we've got Lon on the call, who has experienced that, and there are many others. And the Human Rights Office, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, has also recognized the intimidation of those, sometimes leading to deaths and assassinations of those who are engaging with UN structures and agendas in defense of their people's rights and struggles. So we must remember that too, in terms of the comments that Sister Adjoa has made around what's at stake here. This is about unsettling a world that has been built on as a result of colonialism, our people's dispossession, obviously our enslavement, but continued coloniality. And so that's why we must also understand that the power structures will do everything they can to try and prevent us from undoing that and unsettling that falsity.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Esther. Larry Redmond, you want to go ahead?
I just want to make one small comment. First off, thanking the panelists for this excellent presentation. But I think that we might be deceiving ourselves by characterizing their thoughts about white supremacy as a lie, because they don't know it's a lie. They think it's the absolute truth. And so we're not trying to re-educate them. We've got to try to figure out a way to uproot the truth, quote unquote, in their minds, and maybe just it is a lie. There's no question about that. But they don't know it's a lie. And so it's not like we're trying to re-educate them, because they're not going. I think I made my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, let's see. Are there any other comments, questions?
I would just like to add very quickly, I put it in the chat for people who are going to be in New York for the permanent forum. We're going to be doing a showing of the Durban 400, which was a documentary that was put together during the organizing before and during Durban, in terms of the role that civil society played in terms of pushing that forward. So the information is in the chat, as people to check it out. If you're out of the country, you can You can actually go on YouTube and see it. But for folks who are going to be in New York, also David Comishong, the ambassador, CARICOM, Barbados Ambassador CARICOM will be speaking in a theater on Gaza, who was who was there in Durban and also at the first session of the permanent forum will be there. So it's really a chance for us to exchange and have that kind of discussion that Esther was talking about and that Adjoa was talking about that needs to go on between sessions. But while people are here, it's during that session.
Thank you, Roger. And Roger, go ahead and post the info for the site event again, please. No, yeah. A second time. Someone asked you to post it again.
Okay, I'll do that, and hope that folks will get a chance to. I also posted Jan's information in terms of gives people some background around who he is and why he's being targeted, which is, the U.S. does that. Let me just say very quickly. One time when we were leaving Geneva, the Viola Plummer, who's the head of our organization, got stopped by customs on her way back, and they said because they thought she was trying to smuggle immigrants in her bag. I mean, it's just something absurd. But we had just come back from a session where we were just dressing down the U.S. and exposing them. So I don't put anything past them.
Okay, so I'm gonna turn to Jan right now because I definitely have to close this meeting in like the next few minutes. So I want to give Jan a chance to tell his story.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity to be together with old and new friends. Of course, Roger I've known for more than 30 years since he and Viola started to come to Geneva to the Commission on Human Rights. So it's great to be together here again. Last week, the United States representative in one of the UN bodies in New York stated as follows: United States remain deeply committed to promoting the meaningful participation of non-governmental organizations in the United Nations system without regard for their political beliefs, end quote. Well, that is not so simple because myself, since October 2019, has been prevented from going to the United States of America, and in particular to UN meetings, despite that previously, during a 40-year-long time, I had been there for more than 30 times. And it's like this, that I was very active in the anti-apartheid struggle. I came to the UN to cooperate with the UN, the Special Committee Against Apartheid and so on, since the 1970s and the 60s even. Then when this issue of the end of apartheid came, I was one of the key coordinators of this NGO effort since 1993 to have the decision to have a World Conference on Human Rights, which the US was strongly opposing, even threatening to withhold their financial obligations to the UN. And after that, after the World Conference, which was a great democratic congregation of people and countries, after that, we had the whole struggle of keeping the DDPA alive. So I was the co-chair and coordinator of the Civil Society Forum for the Durban Review Conference in 2009, and I was co-organizer of the Civil Society Conference at the time of the 10th anniversary of the DDPA in New York, and I have been attending to most of the UN meetings and the negotiations on racism. And that's where we have had the constant battle in order to uphold the DDPA. It has been a very complicated work, and that's where, of course, the problematic with the United States of America has appeared because of their pressure on the entire UN bodies to leave the DDPA behind. So now we have a situation that while the US is seeking to mobilize the world against the DDPA, claiming that it can be replaced by something else, they are also resorting to individual targeting of DDPA supporters and defenders who has played a very effective role, who has achieved results. I mean, one of my results, I would say, is that the program of activities of the International Decade states that the implementation of the decade is an integral part of the full and effective implementation of the DDPA. This was adopted by the General Assembly, and even the United States kept quiet when it was adopted. Only Canada and Israel was making complaints after that. So that's where we have this situation. So when I came to the airport in Stockholm in October 2019, I was going there to the US to attend some NGO cooperation things together with our friends from Africa, descendant NGOs and from others, and attend to the negotiations on the resolutions on racism in the General Assembly. Suddenly, I was stopped from checking in at the airport because the Department of Homeland Security had withdrawn my visa exemption, that which is called ESTA. And then, since then, I submitted my visa application. And since then, they have simply refused to respond in any way whatsoever. It's still under, they call it administrative processing. Administrative processing is something that is far more effective to deny someone to come to the US, because if you are rejected, they will have to explain why, and then there is some possibility of appeal. But if you are under administrative processing for more than 3 years, well, then you lose all possibilities to question this falsehood. So now I am invited to the permanent forum by the Office of the High Commissioner, and I thank you to them. They have even sent me a ticket. So I have a ticket to go to the forum, and the director of the Office of the High Commissioner in New York has sent a visa request letter to the US. They don't care. They don't even answer. They say, we are processing your application still. So that's where we are now. So I was supposed to travel on the 29th of May, but now I have actually rescheduled my ticket to be on the 1st of June. Of course, the chances that there will come a visa in the next few days are not great, but still it's an opportunity to raise the issue that there should not, there is an agreement between the United States and the United Nations from 1947, which is called the Headquarters Agreement. And that states very clearly that the United States is under the obligation to accept everyone to come to the UN, and that they would promptly issue visas. This is how it is. They are in violation of their treaty obligations, and they are in violation of the UN ECOSOC resolution on the rights of NGOs, which of course seek to implement this. So this is where we are, and I think the danger of this is, frankly speaking, I did not announce this until now, especially since I got this special invitation from the Office of the High Commissioner and so on, because I did not want this to consume my time and my persona. And I did not want either to send a message to civil society, to NGOs, that what happens if you are critical of the United States and defend the DDPA, then everybody will somehow rethink, and they should not dare to speak so openly about these things. So I think this is why we must stand up against this sort of banning people from attending the forum and UN meetings, that it sends this message of kind of terrorism, like this 40 countries boycott of the DDPA 20th anniversary and so on. I think this is very critical to stand up for it, not because myself, who is a particular person with my particular involvement with the DDPA, because this is really affecting step by step others and will be replicated in a variety of ways. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Jan, thank you so much for coming to tell your story. So a couple of things. Michael from the Uhuru movement is interested in being in touch with you. So I'll give him your contact information. You can share your story some more. And Jan and I also talked about maybe having like a letter or statement that people can sign on to. So Jan, I don't know if that's done yet, but that's something that we can circulate.
Yeah, exactly. We can work on that. Yes. But let me also say I was so happy to hear Adjoa's speaking here, because the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was one of the NGOs that we worked very closely with at the very origin of the campaign to have the World Conference on against racism. I mean, I have an international NGO, International Youth and Student Movement for the UN. I have the World Against Racism Network, which has been very critical in this follow-up and so on. So, you know, it was really good to hear Adjoa, because it is this sort of getting NGOs together. We got, for the campaign to have the World Conference, we got together NGOs who are not together with us now, but nevertheless, it was really this sort of broad campaign. And I think this is so important also to make sure that those who really will support, if they know the facts and the truth, are also engaged in this. So to recover this possibility of a broader mobilization, this is critical. And that is where we have really a challenge also with this sort of thing that is happening with this permanent forum.
Okay, so two things before we end in a couple of minutes. Jan, do you want to go ahead and put your contact information in the chat?
Oh, I will be doing so.
Okay. And all right, so the question was asked, yeah, so there is the opportunity, Ron, for people to appear virtually, but I mean, you know, there's this whole thing of having to sign up to speak and what have you. But the good news is that Jan does have a lot of contacts. And I think that we can probably help to make that happen.
Yes, the people need to protest. That is my answer to the question about who can bring charges against the US for violating its obligations. Well, you have to act towards countries that they should protest in the UN, but also, you see, this is the year of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So this is the year when, I mean, the United States would not like to see itself cornered as anything else but what they claim to be, namely the human rights leader, and even more now, the leader of the fight against racism. So therefore, this sort of things that are happening in a variety of ways is not what they like to see. So therefore, it is good to bring it out publicly. And I think that some can speak about this at the permanent forum. The issue of persecution and retaliation against Durban defenders. And this is a larger issue because it involves all those in variety of countries who really feel that they don't dare to mention the word DDPA because it's a dirty word. That's really why this, I think, should be a really key issue, that of first of making clear that those who are not with the DDPA are not with humanity. And secondly, that those who are seeking to suppress the DDPA and to persecute people should actually be held accountable for that. I thank you.
Okay, all right, Jan, thank you so much. So I actually really do have to close this Zoom. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I will send folks the recording and the chat and Jan's contact info. Thank you, Adjoa, Roger, and Esther for your excellent presentations. Thank you, Jan, for sharing your story. And thanks to all who've tuned in. Let's continue to advocate for implementation of the DDPA within the countries that we live in. And all throughout next week's meeting, let's continue to push the Permanent Forum to make the DDPA central to its work. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry, for all your work.
Well, thank you so much, Adjoa. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay blessed.